Welcome to today's Skeleton Key Study Group webinar. We at the Joseph Campbell Foundation are so happy you've joined us today for this conversation about Campbell's book, Myths to Live By, and the new study guide we've just published to accompany the book. The Joseph Campbell Foundation invites you to experience the power of myth. So if you hear that call to adventure, you are in the right place. The name of this webinar comes from one of Joseph Campbell's early books, which was called A Skeleton Key to Finnegan's Wake, co-authored with Henry Morton Robinson. The book was a guide to reading James Joyce's novel, Finnegan's Wake. We are using that reference to skeleton keys as the name of our new series of study guides for books by Joseph Campbell. So, for example, the Myths to Live By study guide accompanies Campbell's book, Myths to Live By, right? These study guides are intended to companion you as you read Campbell's works, perhaps find yourself inspired by his ideas, and maybe even carry them forward in your own work. My name is Joanna Gardner. I am a mythologist, and I'm the series editor for the Skeleton Key study guides. I feel very fortunate to have the author of the Myths to Live By study guide with us today, Dr. Catherine Svehla. The two of us will have a conversation, then we'll have time for Q&A, so feel free to send us your questions anytime via that Q&A button at the bottom of your Zoom screen. And yes, we do have a promo code to share with you, so if you can resist the temptation to do any book shopping during the webinar, you might find it worth the wait. But before we go on, I'd love to introduce some of the intrepid JCF team who are making this webinar possible today. So let me share my screen. If it works, let's see if it works. There, okay, I think we have the screen share. So with us today, we have the brilliant Tori Yates-Orr, who is our content curator. We also have the amazing Stephanie Zachowski, our operations coordinator, and myself, the study guide series editor and director of marketing and communications here at the foundation. So with that, I'll invite the team to come on camera and say hello and introduce themselves. Tori, would you like to lead us off?
Hi, everyone. I'm just so happy to be here with you all. I'll be joining you in the chat. So if you have any questions, leave them there. But if you have any questions for our presenters, you can put them in the Q&A. So I'm really excited and happy to be joining you.
Thank you, Tori. Steph.
Thanks, Joanna. Yeah, I'm very excited to be here with all of you today. I will be raising your questions up, so please send your questions in as you have them. And yeah, we're just thrilled to be here today with you and talk about some myth.
Thank you, Steph. And thank you to the team for your intros and for making today's webinar possible. So everyone, this is a great time to open up the chat if you haven't already. And let's hear a round of virtual applause for Tori and Stephanie in the chat and everything they do for the work of myth. And while you have the chat open, let's do a chat check-in as well. Let us know where you are zooming in from and if there has been a myth on your mind recently. Feel free to share that as well, or maybe just share the first myth that pops into your mind. So let's bring some myth into the space with us. I am joining today from the Santa Barbara area, and the myth on my mind right now is the story of Ariadne and the labyrinth. Tori, do we have any other myths popping in via the chat yet, or are people still typing?
People are still typing from wherever they are. We've got people from Germany, from Dublin, from Utah, Spain, Nevada, New Jersey, California. I know the myth that's on my mind is the myth of Oshun and Ogun. That's been really popping up to me recently. Let me see what else is going on in the chat. We've got Pandora's box, the hostile brothers archetype, which is a particularly interesting one for me. I have brothers. We've got the myth of Freya, Medusa, Inanna. A lot of people interested.
Oh, that's so wonderful. Thank you so much, Tori. And thank you to everyone for bringing the myths into this space. I can kind of feel the quickening of their presence. So thank you so much for sharing all of that. And welcome to all the myths. Welcome to all the people from all those wonderful places, and welcome to all the myths that you've brought into this space with us. So, okay, great. So before I introduce today's guest of honor, I'd just like to tell you a little bit about what's in one of these study guides. Skeleton keys can open many locks because they have been filed down to the essentials. Skeleton key study guides work the same way. We designed these books to help teachers, students, creatives, book clubs, and all myth-minded readers to discover Campbell's insights and experience the power of myth, and that includes you. You'll find in a study guide concise chapter summaries of Campbell's chapters, plus reading lists and prompts for discussion topics and creative projects. And so here is the cover of the Skeleton Key Study Guide that we're talking about today for Myths to Live By. And here is one of the quotes from the Campbell book that this study guide helps to unpack. You don't ask what a dance means, you enjoy it. You don't ask what the world means, you enjoy it. You don't ask what you mean, you enjoy yourself. And so I just want to show you just a few pages of what it looks like actually inside the guide. This is the first page of the introduction that Catherine wrote for this study guide. And I'll just page through a little bit. You can see the introduction continues here. You don't have to read all this. I just want you to get a sense of what the pages feel like. And then the introduction ends here and we go into chapter 1, and you can see that the chapter begins with a chapter summary. So Catherine wrote a summary of the first chapter of Myths to Live By, which opens, and that summary opens the first chapter of the study guide, right? And so it continues, and you'll see here's a quote that Catherine selected to pull out to highlight in the study guide. The summary continues. Another quote. And then here on the right-hand side, you can see this is where the points of interest begins. This is sort of, Catherine pulled out some topics that were of a special interest to kind of unpack a little bit more. And then you can see the reading lists that Catherine has selected, and the chapter closes with discussion questions and creative prompts. So that's kind of what it looks like inside the study guide. And with that, it gives me great joy to introduce to you Dr. Catherine Svehla. Catherine, come on up to the front of the virtual room. I'll leave the slide up for just a second while I read your bio, and then I'll stop the slide share. Catherine Svehla, PhD, is an independent scholar, consultant, and mentor in the mythic life. She works with artists and creative individuals who want to apply a mythic and archetypal lens to life and work. Catherine offers thought-provoking story circles, workshops, and other mythic tools to open the imagination. Catherine is the host of the Myth Matters podcast, an exploration of myth in contemporary life, and a member of the Joseph Campbell Foundation's Mythmaker podcast network. A recognized innovator in the field of mythological studies, pardon me, Catherine received a new Mythos grant from Opus Archives. You can learn more about Catherine's work at her website, which is mythicmojo.com. So let's hear some virtual applause for Catherine in the chat. And Tori, if you could drop Catherine's website into the chat, that would be great. Okay, let me stop the slide share. See if this works. Okay. All right, great. Okay, so welcome, Catherine. Welcome to the webinar. It is so good to have you here.
Thank you. I'm really happy to be here.
Good. I'm happy that you're happy. So let's just jump right into the conversation. I have some questions for you, which I'll lift up, but feel free to take the questions in any direction that you want with this conversation. And so my first question is sort of kind of your origin story. Like if you could share what drew you to myth itself in the first place? We'd love to hear how that happened for you.
Okay. Well, initially I was attracted to myth because I started making art. I went through kind of a dark night of the soul in my early 30s, and I started making art. It was something I'd been drawn to that I had never allowed myself to do. And I realized, as many do when you start that kind of activity, that I was having a different kind of conversation with myself. And that was my introduction to depth psychology. And of course, when you investigate Jung, then you find yourself into myth. So there was that was kind of the first step. And then I went to art school. When I left art school, I decided to move to New Mexico, and I was there painting and studying Native American art. And in particular, I was looking at a lot of pottery designs. So then I had to read myth to understand what I was looking at. And that's true of really most art. But in that process, I came across a couple of books that made another level of connection for me. Specifically, I read Frank Waters' Book of the Hopi, and then I also came across a collection of essays called Echo Psychology that was edited by Theodore Roszak. And both of those books really, in fact, the Book of the Hopi, I had kind of a head exploding experience the night that I was reading it. Reading those books, I grasped the degree to which our myths are our world. We live in our myths. That's it. And that was it. Like I say, I mean, the profundity of that. And it allowed me to make another connection, because before I started making art, before I went down the mythology rabbit hole, I was an environmental activist. And that realization about how foundational myth was enabled me to make a connection between my ongoing sense of service to the world and to people and to my vision of what was possible for all of us. So the combination of this, of the art and the activism, which were really the two primary threads in my life, realizing that myth was the place those came together, that was it. And it was once I made that connection between what I'll just call my activism, for lack of a better word, and mythology, that was my motivation to get a PhD.
That is so fascinating. Thank you so much for sharing that. I'm taking notes on some of the sound bites that you shared. Our myths are our world. That's one, right? And you talked about the sense of service and how myth is where your art and your activism came together. Did I get that right?
Yes.
Wow, that's so great. Catherine, you and I have worked together a fair amount, and I never knew that story. So thank you for sharing it. I loved hearing that. And of course, visions of Georgia O'Keeffe came up when you were talking about moving to New Mexico and painting.
Right. Well, and I'm actually going to Ghost Ranch later on this summer. But the other thing to add, I mean, I guess I'll just say it, and because we'll all understand the significance of it. Once I went to Pacifica, my second day of coursework at Pacifica was 9/11. So if there had been any question in my mind about the relationship between these things, it was dissolved very early in my process of formal study.
So, I mean, if you would care to share any more about what that experience was like, you're sitting in a myth classroom, 9/11 happens.
Yeah, well, we were, for those of you who aren't familiar with Pacifica, at the time that I was there was a main campus, and then there was a satellite campus at Ladera, which was, and I guess now is, part of Pacifica. At the time, it was still associated with the Catholic Church, and it was a retreat center that was some miles away. And that was a fairly insulated environment. So I got up that morning and I went for a hike with a colleague, a friend that I was in the process of making. We came back for breakfast, and there were people sitting in the dining room, all like, I mean, as soon as you walked in the room, it was like, oh my God, what's going on? And see, there we were, because we were in this little bubble, we all went into the kitchen where they had a TV to watch and try and understand what was going on, because the only news that had come in was from a couple people on the East Coast who had friends text them. So it was really weird. And in a way, I was out of the stream of our collective response to this. Does this make sense? Because I wasn't at home watching with everybody else. It was a couple of days before I was, back at my own home and online and really processing it. And quite a few of my classmates dropped out of the program right away, because they felt that if this was what was happening in the world, then maybe they had other priorities like family or whatever. As I said, for me, because that was my motivation in the first place, it really lent a sense of urgency to what I was there to study.
Oh, interesting. So, I mean, that really kind of leads into, what I had been planning to be my next question, which is, in your opinion, what are some of the most important reasons to study myth? I feel like you've already sort of been talking about that, but I'm wondering if maybe people listening might like to hear a little more about, like, specifically, okay, so all this is going on. What was going through your mind that said, no, this is what I need to do. This is the study.
Right. Well, so the activism part of me, and when I say we live in, our myths are our worlds, the connections that I'd made there were basically along the lines of, well, we think that we're debating facts. We go through these debates and these pantomimes about information that we're exchanging, as if we're all making rational decisions about things, like whether or not we should pollute our drinking water, for example. Seems like a no-brainer to me, but it's not. Why is that? Well, because we have these underlying perspectives and ideas about what is natural, what's true, what reality is, that are actually derived from our myths, from what we've imagined. And so I think that one of the reasons that you would want to study myth is to know that, to be able to add that perspective to all of the other different ways that we have at our disposal to understand history and human life and ourselves. You could say, well, any given situation, you can look at it historically, you can look at it artistically, you can look at it psychologically, you can look at it, the economics of it. We have all these different ways of parsing it. But unless you use mythology, you're missing the foundation. You're missing what is creating all of these other perspectives. And I think that's important if you have any aspirations for the world, which I do. And I also think it's important for your own life. Do you want to be a self-determining, responsible, creative individual living your life? Or do you want to just play the old game?
And so that was super great. Can we say that again? Do you want to be a responsible, self-creating? I missed a word. What was it?
I don't know if I can repeat myself.
I think
I was
a responsible, self-creating individual, responsible for living your own life. Something like
your own life, right? Yeah. Because one of the things one of the, and I think this is something that Campbell talks about a lot. In fact, I think this is one of his primary message, which is that unless you can see through, the value system and the ideas and institutions that you've inherited, you can't really find your place in it. So there are some things to reject and some things to accept and some things to innovate on or whatever. But unless you really get to that level of going, oh, this is the imagined world that I was born into. Is it my vision? And in what ways is it or is it not? Then you're missing the whole conversation about your life. And I did want to, in thinking about this, I did want to focus on one thing that is in the study guide, if I could do that. Because I think one of Campbell's really useful ideas is the 4 functions of mythology. And he talks about it in different books. He doesn't talk about it specifically in Myths to Live By, but it percolates through the whole book. And for that reason, in one of the chapters, I think, what did I note here? Chapter 3, I wrote about it as the point of interest. So maybe as a way of elaborating on this idea that we live in an imaginary world, Campbell just explained that by saying, well, here's 4 different ways that mythology really is the container for our lives. And so to give people a flavor even of how I approached this, what I wrote in how I explained this in the points of interest. So he's talking about, this is chapter 3, which is about rites and why we need ritual. In this chapter, Campbell explains our need for cultural forms and their source in our myths. These forms operate in our lives on 4 levels, which correspond to Campbell's definition of the 4 functions of myth. Myth connects us to the mysteries of life and experience of awe and wonder. This is the mystical function. So the first one is this, just the sense of being like, wow, I'm here in this place. Mythology should give us that. Myth also provides our image of the cosmic order. This is the cosmological function. So that's sort of, how did we get here? Why are we here? How is everything organized? The cosmological function of myth gives rise to the sociological function. People create the forms that define and organize their society. Finally, the myths and forms guide an individual through all phases of life, from birth to death. This is the pedagogical or teaching function of myth. And I think most of the time that we talk about mythology, we're primarily focused on that last one, on how myths can guide us. But again, I think it's really important to realize that that same kind of guidance is happening on all of these other levels, and particularly socially.
Well, and I love that sense of getting to reality by learning to see through the transparency of the imaginal, right? And getting to authenticity by learning to see what's inauthentic, right? Like sorting the wheat from the chaff through means of myth.
Yes.
Yeah. Thank you so much for sharing that.
Yeah.
One of the things that I just really, really appreciated about your study guide is the clarity. I just like, when I first read it, the clarity felt like, the sound of a bell ringing, the clarity with which you distill the ideas down. And so I was curious if you could share with us what it was like for you to take Campbell's book, right? To take this and then create this from it and really, really distill and clarify the ideas. But just curious if you had any thoughts about what that was like, especially as from your perspective as a creative person.
Right. Well, it's interesting that you showed those 2 covers of the book, because here's an even older one, ladies and gentlemen. This is like a 70s edition of the book. So I was telling Joanna earlier that in many ways, my relationship to Campbell started with this book. Like a lot of people, I saw The Power of Myth. I thought it was great. It helped me leave Christianity, but I really didn't. I really didn't think very much about Campbell, and primarily the hero's adventure, which I now appreciate more than I did. It didn't really resonate with me all that much. And then, actually, in graduate school, we didn't talk about Campbell very much. And so it just so happened that I moved to Nashville right before I was going to start writing my dissertation. So I had been in California doing my graduate work. So I left that whole energy field and, the locus there at Pacifica. And I went into a used bookstore and I saw this book. And I was like, oh, Myths to Live By, Joseph Campbell. And I don't know what other people think when they first hear this title. But I realized as soon as I opened the book that there was a part of me that was going, myths to live by. What are they? And guess what? There's no answer in here. So I think that this book, more than any other, illustrates Campbell's agenda. He talks about why we need myth. As I said, he doesn't really lay out the 4 functions specifically, but every chapter goes back and back and back and back and back at like why we need these stories. He talks about the problems with the myths that we've inherited. He talks about how you can find a myth, but that's a little bit buried. And he talks about a lot of myths. He offers a lot of options. Now, this is a long way of answering your question, but when I sat down with this book initially, I have so many notes in here. I started annotating it, like trying to understand the book, trying to understand the ideas. And I think that's really important. But I was still engaged with it as material, like, oh, can I learn the way Campbell thinks about Zen? And that's important. But what's really inspiring to me about Campbell is the example of his life, that he lived this, he did this. And when I sat down with this book again, I realized, oh, wow, Campbell said that when he started putting this book together, he realized that these were the things that he had been talking about for years. And I realized, oh, so what he's saying is, in many ways, this is his myth. Because these are the themes, these are the things that have attracted him over and over and over again. And that is how you find your myth. He says it all the time, but it seems like we miss it because we think it's got to be some other thing, or maybe because we're looking for the story. But he's like, hey, these are the ideas, these are the themes, these are the things that have inspired me. This is my myth.
That's so.
And I realized also that he was in his 60s, which I now am, barely, but still. And so that adds another element, because at this stage of my life, I'm having that experience of realizing, oh, there have been certain things that I have pursued my whole life. And every time that I have done what it seems that Campbell did, which is to make the turn towards it, no matter how ridiculous it seemed or impractical, my life has opened up to another level. So
to make the turn towards it.
Yes.
I mean, I feel like that's another way of saying follow your bliss, right? Make the turn. Three words, both of them: follow your bliss, make the turn. I love it. And you know, the whole idea of Campbell's work, especially in Myths to Live By, as less of a what and more of a how, right? The approach. And it reminds me of all the myths that were shared in this space, right? Those are the myths, right? And this is an approach, and this is some guidance into how to apply the approach, is kind of what's coming up for me, you know, Oshun and Ogun, that there's the myth, and here are some ideas for how to work with that myth, for example, or Ariadne and the Labyrinth, and all the others, Pandora and Nana, all of them that came in.
Right.
So yes, to make the turn, right? I
Right,
read it
right.
down.
I mean, I
Make
think one of the things that's fantastic about the study guides, and, you know, and I'm really looking forward to all of them, because I know they're all going to have this element, is the questions and the prompts. Because you have to make the material your own, not because it's important that you really get every point the way Campbell thought it, but that it launches you, you know, into your own exploration.
Yeah, I agree. I think the prompts are an amazing kind of addition to the conversation in the study guides. And one of the things I love also is how individual the prompts are. Like, your prompts are your own. And you'll see as the other guides come out that every study guide author is really generous in the way they've shared themselves, especially in offering those prompts. Thank you for raising that up. I appreciate it.
Yeah, yeah.
And it kind of, again, once again, you anticipated my questions. I was wondering if you had any thoughts about how best to use the study guide, like especially from your perspective as a coach and a teacher and a storyteller, as an artist, or from any other perspective at all. Like, how can you imagine people using this study guide and kind of getting the most out of it?
Well, okay, so I think this is a hard book. Maybe I'm not supposed to say this or admit this, you know, because I've got the PhD in mythology, but I find Campbell rather hard to read. And this is a hard book because every chapter, he goes into so many different nooks and crannies, and the depth of the man's expertise is just breathtaking. My hope is that the study guide will help readers get a better get the lay of the land. Like, okay, so this is generally what he's talking about. These are the issues. And then also be able to latch on to his enthusiasm as much or more than the details, and use the prompts maybe, or think of your own things to then go, okay, so what do I want to do with this? You know, so I hope that people will look at the guide maybe at the beginning, you know, chapter by chapter, to get some orientation, because otherwise you might get discouraged. I did. I know. I picked this book up many times. And like I say, I started annotating it myself because I thought this is the only way I'm going to read it. But get the book. Get the book. The other thing, in addition to working the material, maybe kind of toggling back and forth, is that it was important to me in the resources to include audio lectures. And it's not like they're a perfect fit in every case, because again, every time Campbell talks about one thing, he talks about 25 things, which is part of why he's so inspiring and why you can just pick up one of his books and read one page and then put it down and think about it for a month. He's marvelous to listen to. And when I got the grant that you mentioned in my little bio, and I got to spend time in his archives, I would go to his library and put on headphones and listen to him for hours. And it was fantastic. So I really encourage people to use the audio lectures.
Awesome. Thank you. And I appreciate you lifting up his enthusiasm as well. And I think that kind of goes back to looking to Campbell for approach more than dogma, right? Kind of the spirit of Campbell, and allowing today to be today, but his enthusiasm is available. You kind of get a hit of it when you read him or listen to a lecture, right? Or the little clips on social media, even those kind of work, a little like, right, a little like shot of awe. So thank you for raising that. And I love it that your copy from the 70s is annotated. Like there you were in the 70s annotating it. And here you are, the author of the study guide of the book that you annotated. So cheers to you for that. That's fantastic. So before we go to Q&A, so everyone listening, now's the time to put your questions into that Q&A. Click the button that says Q&A and put your questions in there, because that's how we'll be able to get to them. And then we'll start raising your questions for Catherine in just a second. But first, Catherine, just one final question. Do you have any final advice for readers, or like a wish for them? If you could offer a wish for their experience of this work, what would it be? Let's say you're our fairy godmother right now. What blessing would you bestow upon us?
Well, I think I just said it. It's his enthusiasm. It's to be able to like get on the wave of his enthusiasm. And it's not just his enthusiasm for mythology, it's his enthusiasm for life. And I hope that is something that is present in the study guide, that one of the things that I wanted to communicate, but nobody can really communicate Campbell's passion as well as he can, but is, to let yourself get caught up in his enthusiasm for life. Because one of the other things that is so interesting about myth that Campbell brings us back to over and over and over and over and over again is that here we are, looking for a story, a story out there, or our story, in order to be able to kind of explain things to ourselves. But the ultimate point is to find something that just launches us beyond it into the place where it's just aliveness. And he goes right up to that over and over and over again in Myths to Live By. And so that's what I hope you get.
Thank you. That's so great. That sense of aliveness. And what it's bringing up for me is, Campbell's enthusiasm functions as like, a match to light our own enthusiasm, right? We will never have Campbell's enthusiasm. It's impossible, but his enthusiasm can awaken our own in whatever expression that takes. And I really think that the study guide that you've written can help people, move in that direction, make that turn, as you would say, make that turn, the trademark Catherine Svehla. Awesome. Okay, well, so let's turn to some Q&As. Stephanie, do we have any questions coming in? There you are.
Hi. Yes.
And everyone, now's the time. Put those questions for Catherine into the Q&A.
So yes, we've got quite a few right now. I am going to, so speaking of the turn that you just spoke of, and this is from Johanna. Hi, Johanna. We know you. So in German, the word for turning point is different from simply turning. And then these are German words, so forgive me. Wiedenpunkt and Abegin. So this leads us to a transformative idea. The first word I think of is this is moments in our lives, this turning. I like this idea because I feel I am at this point, and this can be so rich. And so she's asking, what myths do you see as reflecting these Widenpunkt, this transformative idea turn moments?
Transformative. Well, I guess maybe because I'm totally in the Campbell brain to do this webinar, the first thing that occurs to me is Parsifal, with a story that Campbell loved so much. And it's there's very early in the story, he feels the call, and that, okay, we've heard that a million times, so it can be kind of dead. But the image in the story is that you have this young man who really doesn't know anything about the world. He's been living in the woods with his mom, and these knights come riding through, and he doesn't even know what they are. They come riding through on their horses, and at first he thinks they're angels. And he steps out in front of him and he's like, oh my God, my mom told me they were angels. It's kind of ridiculous, but it is the way that but it's really beautiful in his naivete. And they say, no, we're not. And he finds out they're knights. And then he's like, that's it, I'm going to be a knight. Now, there's zero support for that in his life. He has no idea, but he goes and finds King Arthur. And I think that's what those moments are like. Something just sort of wings in, and then, you can't let go of the fascination. And to not let yourself be talked out of it. So that's the first story that occurs to me.
And a sense of epiphany, right? The sacred
Yes.
shining through, like he wasn't wrong. They're not literally angels, and yet the sacred was shining through in that moment.
I love that. That's great. Yeah. Great insight. For me, that's one of the best images of the call and making that turn.
I love it. Thank you.
Okay, yeah, this is wonderful. I'm taking notes.
I know, right? I think we're recording, so we don't have to write it.
Okay, the next question is from Zuzu. I believe I'm saying that correctly. Do you think it's possible to have an original story? Or are they all just a retelling of myths, or a myth or other stories that originally they just no longer exist?
Well, I don't think it's possible to be original in the sense of never been done. Well, see, the terminology here, and the use is the word just in the question? Just?
Do you think it's possible to have an original story, or are they all just retelling of myths?
Okay. Yeah. So that I hate those justs. And that's really my answer, which a reworking is original. That we use material, that we have to create out of something doesn't render what we make unoriginal. And I think that that's a interesting way maybe of thinking about the mythic part of our lives, which is because that's the intersection of what is individual and unique and specific about us, and the fact that we're here in this huge big thing, that we're part of a human species, that we're part of a world, that we're in a flow of time and space. I don't know that I necessarily want to be removed from all of that. And yet I can say something that's never been said before about it. So the idea that originality is just opposed against a just reworking, I think, is the thing to question.
I'm sensing a great big yes and, right? Like, yes, you can be original, and yes, you're going to be building on everything that's come before. and that, you know, that's the beauty of originality. And originality can kind of take different forms. Like some innovations are small and very incremental, and other innovations, you know, feel larger and have more impact, but innovation is innovation, right? And creativity is that which is new and useful. That's the definition of creativity. And
Right,
so
right.
I loved what you said, Catherine.
Right. And
Taking out the just, right? Just
right.
take that out.
Yeah. And, you know, I mean, it's when I was in art school, Picasso, who's not one of my heroes for reasons I won't go into, but he drew a circle. And he said, every artist should draw a circle because that is your originality. And he was talking about exactly this thing, because nobody will draw the same circle. You make that motion with your hand, that is yours. And yet it's a circle. So that's another way of putting it.
Love it. Thanks. Steph, more questions? How are we doing?
Yeah, there's quite a few questions actually.
We'll keep going. We'll keep going.
This one's fascinating. Okay, regarding AI and its fluid understanding of mythological language, how can we as Joseph Campbell scholars keep on top of this new wave, mythological weave into our daily lives? This is future forecasting. Of course, we can just surmise, but it's really important to open that conversation and make it ongoing.
Okay.
Question. I got a little lost.
Yeah,
What was
I don't know that there's a question there. I think it's just speaking to AI right now and how it is tapping into mythological language and maybe how we enter that conversation as scholars.
Okay. Yeah, well, so I guess I'll just say there are a couple of things about that interest me about AI that I think that come from my work as a mythologist and my relationship to myth. One of them is I was really struck by, and probably people, others of us here in this group saw this. Do you remember a story that about a month ago where this guy got into a conversation with a bot and it tried to then seduce him and suggest that he didn't love his wife and all this other stuff? And when I read that, I thought, oh, this is really interesting, because what this is revealing to me is how unconscious we are about what we're doing and saying. It's not, it got me wondering, not about this particular conversation and the content of this man's marriage. I think it was a man who was in but more where these themes exist in, this big cauldron of cultural inputs that AI was drawing on. So I thought, oh, this could be a really interesting Rorschach test in some ways of what the invisible myths are that are moving around in our collective psyche. So that's one thing that I think could be very interesting to explore, and something that's going to be full of a lot of surprises. The other thing that I've thought about some, and again, this is a big part of the conversation, is the quality of what can be generated and whether or not they're going to replace human creativity or not. I'm not sure, but I don't think they're the same thing, but I'm also very curious about what will be learned. because those technologies learn so much faster than we do. So
It's fascinating
that's-
stuff.
yeah,
I love that idea of AI as a mirror, of like bringing to consciousness what is like currently invisible to any given person when they log onto the internet, right? You start talking to it, you find out, whoa, what's going on behind the curtain there.
yeah. And I think it's going to be very important for mythologists to be part of that conversation so that we don't end up because I'm sure that many people in lots of different fields will explore this, and are already thinking about this. But in the same way that any new information that comes into the culture immediately gets concretized and literalized and like tied down to its particular field, rather than, used as a lens to go, oh, okay, so this is a statement about our imaginary world again. I think that, it's going to be people who are thinking about myth who are going to prevent that from happening. And we're going to need that in order to really get the real value out of these insights.
Yeah, I'm reminded of the Earthrise image on the front of the book and how that was such a transformational and kind of frightening moment at that time. Awe-inspiring, but also, what does this mean? And similar
Potentially a turning point, to use Johanna's term, right?
Yeah.
Right. And Campbell notes the inadequacy of the response, how people didn't get it. And they didn't get it because they didn't see it mythologically. And that's, another reason to read the book and not just content yourself with the study guide. Because I think I allude to that, but you want to read that part, and anyway.
That's a great point.
Do we have time for more? We have more questions.
Yeah, we have time for probably 2, maybe 3 more questions, then we'll need to be wrapping up.
Okay, so this is a question. Are there different myths for different stages and situations in life? And if so, how do you find and recognize a right myth?
Well, so yes, there are different myths for different stages in life. But I would kind of flip it around and say, at different stages in life, we have different concerns and questions. And so therefore then have told ourselves stories about all of them. So at any point in time, depending on where you are in your life, you're going to be drawn to stories that speak to it. And I want to emphasize again how important it is to not so much look for the story, but more to put yourself in a situation where you are listening to, reading, experiencing stories, and notice what attracts your attention. The importance and the significance and the value in a story isn't inherent in the story. It's a function of how it lands with you. So, again, back to this, like the difference between using myth to find yourself and to find your own orientation versus myth as the material. I think I'm answering the question.
I think so. Hey, if I could distill, I would, if I had a highlighter pen, I'd be highlighting what you said about paying attention to what's drawing you, right? That's my takeaway.
Yeah. I mean, this is, I guess I'll mention here that in my podcast, I mean, one of the reasons that I think it would be it's really useful to listen to my podcast regularly, is because of this, like exposure to stories and the encouragement to do exactly what I'm saying, which is to be exposed regularly to a sampling of stories and mythological material, with the idea being that, something attracts your attention, you can pursue that, on your own. Because even though there are different concerns in life, and so therefore then different stories that speak to them, I can also say that I have revisited some stories many, 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 many times with and with a range of concerns. And that's the way that a story can interact with wherever you are in a given moment is the idea behind the story oracle readings, that tool that I developed that I use with people. So
awesome, thank you. It kind of puts me in mind of the Hillmanian question, who is visiting at any given point in life, who, as in what story, is visiting, right?
Mm-hmm.
And attending to that. Steph, I think, we have time. Okay, one more question. Let's do one more question, then we'll need to wrap up.
Yeah, if we have one more, I think it would be great. So we had, while you were talking about your coursework and things of that nature, we had a question pop in about, where would someone study mythology? And I think you've shown some different entrance points, talking about the study guide, talking about the podcast, talking about the audio lectures, but maybe if you could speak a bit to different ways people can study myth.
Well, there's so much material out there. I mean, obviously, I went and I got a PhD. I think that I don't think that's necessary. Depending on how far you want to go with it. I would just start sampling things. I would read fairy tales. I would read old fairy tales, new fairy tales. I'd find free stuff on the internet. I'd look at Joseph Campbell. I would listen to podcasts. I'd watch movies with this idea in mind. And whenever you find something that interests you, and it doesn't have to be a big earth-shattering thing. I mean, I love that we got onto this, that we talked about the turning points and how Campbell's life models that. But everything doesn't have to be earth-shattering. It can be like, oh, I'm reading this story and what's the deal with the frog? And then just do research on frogs, find more frog stories. Do it your own way, I guess is what I'm saying. And there's so much material out there that you'll never exhaust it. That's one of the things that's exciting about being a mythologist or being interested in it. I mean, you're never going to get to the end of it. Making art. Back to the study guide again. There are lots of different ways that you can interact with stories too. So when we say study, it doesn't have to just be reading and making notes and, getting it all down like in your head. Make art out of it. Write a poem. Walk around and talk to the trees about it. There's all different ways to interact with something that you find in a myth that's interesting, and it's all understanding myth. It's all that exploration.
That's awesome. Thank you, Catherine. I love the example of you reading a fairy tale and you go, what's the deal with the frog? And that's a way in, right? That's a call to adventure right there. That question, what the heck is going on with the frog?
Yeah.
And I would add too, just a really super, kind of practical thing. If you haven't already, subscribed to the Campbell Foundation's Myth Blast newsletter, because every week the foundation sends out a newsletter with this thing called a Myth Blast, which is a really short little essay by some contemporary person reflecting on some aspect of mythology. And so it's a great way to kind of stay in the conversation as it's ongoing, in addition to all the other explorations of art and study and embodied practice and everything. So, and I think, Tori, if we have the URL, I think it's jcf.org/subscribe is where to subscribe to the newsletter. So thank you so much, Catherine. Let's hear it in the chat. Let's hear a round of virtual applause.
Oh, but you reminded me of one thing I forgot. I know I'm
okay.
over there, but okay. So another thing from the Joseph Campbell Foundation. This book,
Myth and Modern Living,
by Stephen Geringer, which came out recently. Stephen's doing this in this book. It's just a delightful, but he's using, his jumping off points are Campbell, but then he's like thinking about all of this stuff and weaving all of these things together. And so it's a super fun companion and an illustration of somebody else who's doing, finding his own way through myth.
That's so awesome. Thank you so much for lifting that up, Catherine. And you know, Stephen is one of our colleagues here at the foundation, and you can find his book on the jcf.org shop. So if you go to jcf.org and then click the little shop link, it'll take you to the bookshop and you can get the ebook there. And I totally agree, Catherine. I think Stephen is walking the talk for sure. And the book is fabulous. Okay, so we need to wrap up. We're 1 minute over, but let's just stay on for one more minute if you have the time. Would love for you to open up the chat again. And if you haven't already, a little chat applause for Catherine. And if you have something that you'll be taking away with you today, some myth, another different myth, or something Catherine said, or something anyone said, some mythic idea, if you feel like sharing it in the chat, I'm sure everyone else would love to hear what's on your mind as well. And so while you do that, I am going to embark upon the adventure of slide sharing. Let's see if this works. Wait. Oh, wait, hang on 1 second. There we go. Okay. Thank you for hanging in with me, everyone. Okay, I think we have slide share. So here is the promo code that we promised you. It is Myths to Live, all caps, MYTHS, number 2, LIVE. That's the promo code you can use on the JCF shop. To get the e-bundle, you can get both the Myths to Live by book ebook and the study guide ebook for $9.99 for the two of them. So that's a nice discount. We hope you take advantage of it, and we will include that in the email that we send out as well after this webinar. And Tori, if we have that link to the e-bundle in the shop, that would be great if we could drop it in the chat. And Tori, also, has anyone shared any takeaways in the chat? Any myths or mythic ideas that they'll be carrying away with them today?
Yeah, I think the main one is that individualized look at myth and how it can relate back to our own personal stories. I've seen a lot of people be drawn to making the turn, which I think is so needed for all of us who have gone through many different stages in life. I think people are really drawn also to the fact that the small changes that we're drawn to can be just as important as the very big arcs of myth as well.
Awesome. Thank you so much. Thank you, Tori. And thank you for everyone who shared. Really kind of brings the conversation home. Okay, we are almost there, but before we wrap for today, I wanted to let you know, I want you to be the first to know that there is another study guide available now. This one is the Pathways to Bliss study guide, which accompanies Campbell's book, Pathways to Bliss, right? The study guide is by Dr. Bradley Olson, and you can see his photo here on the slide. That you can find the study guide on Amazon and the jcf.org shop now, and you can also register for our next Skeleton Key Study Group webinar, where we'll be talking with Brad. It's going to be super fun. It's on September 2nd. And Tori, if we have that link to register for the webinar, let's drop that in the chat as well. So everyone mark your calendar for the next webinar. We'll see you then. And thank you so much for joining us today. Thank you to Tori and to Stephanie and to Catherine. We'll leave the webinar open for a few minutes so that you can wrap up any conversations you have going and copy out any links that you need to get. And I hope you enjoy the Myths to Live By study guide. I hope you post your review on Amazon or social media or whatever. And most of all, I hope you join us for our next webinar. Thank you so much and have a great day.